No, seems like it's going this time. Okay. Yeah, looks like it. Yep. Okay. All right. Thanks. No, seems like it's going this time. Okay. I'm hearing my echo. Start the video. There we go. Oh. All right. Good morning, everybody. So we have 2 more Sundays until Passover, until Pesach. And at which point the mitzvah of counting the Omer, which is the focus of this discourse, is activated. We can actually put all this into action. So let's see if we can pull it off. Well, actually, we have 3, including today. Let's see. We should be able to pull it off. All right. Okay, we're gonna go back just a little bit. So we're gonna be on the bottom of the second page. Where it says 5 lines from the bottom, where it says this is indicated by the fact. So just to bring us back to the present. So we've been talking about the idea of the godly soul running away from Egypt towards God and the revelation at Sinai. That is the movement towards, and the revelation at Sinai being the return, right? As we've discussed many times, the idea of pursuing a vision, pursuing an ideal, and then allowing that vision and ideal to settle in, the beating of the heart, the diastolic and the diastolic. Thank you. One day I'll get it right. But that is essentially the pulse of all of existence, and that is the exodus from Egypt, running towards the revelation at Sinai, and the revelation at Sinai being the return to empower us to then set the next goal, this next ideal, the next pursuit. And we discussed that this is achieved through contemplation and prayer, when we basically work on increasing our God consciousness, moving away from our ego and our self-consciousness to bring an awareness of God into our day-to-day experience. And when we do that, then we experience the exodus from Egypt, Egypt being those things that hold us back, those constraints that prevent us from being able to fully live consistent with who we are at our core, a godly being. And those things that challenge us, as soon as we realize that they're basically a concealment of the divine, we're able to navigate through them and work towards our goal. That's the exodus from Egypt, and this is our journey. The Alter Rebbe posed a challenge, and that is that this is all as it relates to the godly soul, right? This is the godly soul, the godly part of us that is on this journey, right? The way we described everything, it's eliminating the concealment, eliminating the blockage that prevents us from experiencing the divine. But if we are to stand at the foot of Mount Sinai and receive the revelation at Sinai, God was not giving the Torah to souls alone. He was giving the Torah to souls in bodies. So the body also needs to be able to be a receptacle. It has to be aligned in order to experience the same revelation that the soul is going to experience. We are, for better or for worse, bodies and souls are united as long as we're on this earth. And we can't experience godliness with only a part of us. It has to be an integrated event. But the body is an animal. It's an animal soul. So how do we get the animal soul, whose interest is entirely itself, to align itself with the divine? So for this, we have the mitzvah of the counting of the Omer, which is the basis of this discourse, which begins first with the waving of the Omer. As the Torah says, on the day after the Shabbos, on the morrow of the Sabbath, not referring specifically to the Sabbath, but to the day of rest of the first day of Passover. On the day after the first day of Passover, we wave the Omer offering, and then subsequently we begin to count the 7 days 7 times. This event of waving the Omer offering and counting is the mechanism by which we transform the animal soul into being a fitting receptacle to receive the divine. How? So the first thing we need to know is that the Omer offering that was waved, was a barley offering, as opposed to a wheat offering. What is a barley offering? A barley offering in Torah tradition is animal food. Barley is animal food. The idea being immediately that what we're trying to do here is we're trying to access the animal component and expose, we're lifting it up, we're waving it up, we're exposing its true identity. And as we discussed, that there's this notion that the animal is a bad thing. But the truth is, the animal is not neither a bad thing nor a good thing. It just is, right? Can you say even a ferocious, predatory animal is not a bad animal? It's not a good animal. It's not a bad animal. It's not good when predatory animals attack humans, but that's not really their design. Their design is to live in the jungle or wherever else they live and attack whatever prey they need to attack. It's an anomaly when humans get in the way or they end up in human space. You know, like we saw that during COVID, there were certain cities where the animals came back out, right? That was their habitat. And when the humans got out of the way, the animals came back to their space. Okay, we're not getting into a political conversation here, but the idea being is that animals are designed to, predatory animals attack animals, and herbivore animals eat the grass and the trees and the berries and whatever else they eat. And they do what they're designed to do. And there's nothing wrong with a lion attacking a deer in the bush, because that's what lions do. And that's part of the cycle. That's part of the way things are supposed to work. Now, I don't necessarily want a lion in my house. I don't necessarily want a deer either in my house, but a puppy or a cat, my girls would love to have one of those. We're not getting them anytime soon, but they would love to, right? And at least we go to PetSmart and they get to cuddle the cats and stuff like that. But it's just an animal. It's just a neutral thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. The Alter Rebbe tells us that the animal soul, the human animal soul, is actually a very, very holy thing. It shows up here as being neutral and maybe driving us towards self-interest, which sometimes can push us to not just self-interest, but selfish interests that can actually cross over the line from the neutral to the prohibited, right? That's what happens when we get caught up in self. Sometimes we'll do things that are in our interest, even at the expense of others. That's part of the danger of ego, which is why we need to align the ego and redirect the animal soul. But that aside, fundamentally, the animal soul is a manifestation of something extremely holy. And it's so holy that when it shows up on this earth, it shows up as something lower than the godly soul. Because the nature of things are that this higher something originates, the lower it falls. As we discussed, if you take two stones and you drop one from 100 meters and one from 50 meters, the one from 100 meters is going to make a much bigger hole in the earth than the one at 50 meters. Why? Because it's coming from a higher place. So if we look, it says in the Talmud that the world is upside down, right? That which is higher above and lower above shows up in this earth as a mirror image. The lower shows up higher and the higher shows up lower. So our job is to recognize that this animal soul is actually very holy. And actually that recognition is the key to the transformation. When we are able to recognize that our animal soul and its drives are actually very holy, that empowers us to not get caught up in our selfishness, but to redirect that drive to something of purpose and meaning. Again, on a very basic level, when we face challenge and our body, our emotional system, and even our thinking sometimes, which can also belong to the animal soul, feels crushed and trapped by the circumstance. In other words, we're thinking from the animal perspective, which is not the truth. It's just what meets the eye. When we tell the animal soul, listen, you're much holier than you seem to present. You actually have a much higher source. So yes, you're facing challenge, but what are you called upon to do? What is this moment? What is it calling upon you? Is it calling upon you to fall apart? Or is it calling upon you to grow, to stretch yourself, to find inner resources that perhaps you were not aware of before? When we tell the animal soul, recognize that you have a higher source than the godly soul, that itself, that notion itself shifts the thinking from being subject to the circumstance, from being a victim of the circumstance, to becoming the director of what's to transpire from that point forward. Right? Why do I see myself as a victim? Because I feel like something is more powerful than me. That's the definition of being a victim. You, the circumstance, world, life, God, whatever, made me a victim. I'm subject to the circumstance. When I don't see myself that way, and I realize that I'm more powerful than the circumstance, suddenly I'm not a victim anymore. I now have the capacity to begin to choose what I'm going to do. So if we think about it, the godly soul does not have capacity to do anything other than to feel and love God. On this earth, it needs the body, it needs the animal soul in order to function, to do anything of value on this earth. The godly soul is a spiritual entity. It's the body that does all the good on this earth. So the animal soul can be subjugated. In other words, you can take your cow or ox and you can put a yoke on it and say, you're going to do exactly what I say. Or you can take your horse and whip it and tell the horse, you're going to obey. And that's one way to do it. And in such an instance, you let the animal know that it's an animal. But that's not the ultimate. The ultimate is to transform the animal, to say to the animal, let's not fight. This is in your interest. This is better for you. There's good stuff over here. Don't run for the physical, material pleasures. Let's work on higher pleasures that are in your interest. Why are they in your interest? Because you're very holy. You have a very high source. You're a very lofty being. So don't subjugate yourself to the circumstances. So the act of waving the omer, right? I want you to envision this, right? We take this offering and it's waved in all directions, right? What is the waving? The waving is in elevating, it's lifting something up. What does it mean to lift something up? What does it mean when you lift somebody's spirits up? You don't necessarily physically lift them up. You help them feel differently than they're feeling. What we're trying to do is we're trying to be elevated, to be lifted up from our circumstances of seeing our animal as something against us, or at best neutral, to seeing it as a very powerful. Now, how do we know that the animal soul has a very high source? So this is what he discussed, the idea that the Yechezkel, Ezekiel, in his prophecy ascended to heaven, and there he saw the divine chariot, and on the divine chariot, he saw these various different images of animals. We also have the notion of the this massive copper wash basin, copper basin that King Solomon built, that was sitting on the backs of these 12 oxen, 3 facing in each direction, representing the idea that this big basin represents the transitional point where the divine energy becomes manifest in a physical way. And this is the transition where the physical animal is manifest, but what it really is in its core is divine revelation. And those were the various different sources that he brought for us. Specifically, we spoke at length about the idea of the various different names of God. The primary name of God, the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, and the different ways to spell that, and how they have different numeric values. The specific numeric value of 52 being the transition point for where the source of the animal soul, and that's why 52 is also the numeric value of the word behema in Hebrew, which means animal. So the word behema in Hebrew has the numeric equivalent of 52, and that divine name, like any name, is a transition point for manifestation. What's the purpose of a name? The purpose of a name is to express ourselves, right? A name, a title, they're all ways to express different aspects of who we are, especially so with God. God's names, God doesn't need a name. We need God's names because they're different channels through which God manifests himself. So the name 52, the name Ban in Hebrew, is the name through which the animal manifestation shows up on this earth. But to tell us that its origin is this very profound divine name of God. Okay, so now okay, now we are on page 4. The very top of the page, the first words there, the nurture for the animal kingdom. Okay, so now as we discussed, the offering is a barley offering. And in Hebrew, the word for barley is sa'ora. So if you look at the last word on the line there, sa'or, and then you have the letter hey, okay? The words are read a little differently. The same letters in the same sequence, but we're going to read the words differently. Instead of reading it sa'ora, we're going to read it shior, hey. The word shior means to measure. The hey is the 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Hey is 5. We know in the mystical flow of the divine, we have at every manifestation has both a revelation energy and also a holding back energy. At every level, there's a revelation and there's concealment. Let's give a simple analogy for this. whether you're teaching a 2-year-old or you're teaching a 50-year-old, you have to, and you have information that they don't have, you have to both reveal, because you want to educate, you want to share something, but you also have to hold back, because the 2-year-old can't understand everything that you want to communicate. If you try to speak to them like you're speaking to the 50-year-old, they're not going to get anything. It's just going to be, at best, overwhelming, probably go over their head, right? So you have to package what you're saying, which means you have to reveal, but you also have to conceal. The same thing is true with the 50-year-old. If you have information the 50-year-old doesn't have, you have to reveal, because that's your objective, but you also have to conceal. By the way, concealing doesn't necessarily even have to be that sophisticated. Even the words you choose to say is a form of concealment. You're choosing to use these words as opposed to those words. And you're also choosing to say one word at a time. Not that you can say more than one word at a time, but if you speak very fast and you jumble your words, then they're not going to understand anything either, right? So everything needs to be, there's a measure that takes place. There's a measurement, there's an evaluation, there's an assessment, and a boundary that takes place every time we're doing some act of revelation. And really, this takes place at the very beginning of all of the creative process. When we talk about, this is total parenthetical, but it's coming to mind. When we talk about God himself, we use, in Hasidic language, we use a simple term to refer to God, and that's atzmos. Atzmos just means essence, right? Essence is beyond description. It's just essence. It is what it is. Anything outside of essence already has the need for measure. As soon as you step out of essence, we're already beginning to measure. And when we study the various different books of Jewish mysticism, we find discussions about multiple levels of divine revelation immediately after we talk about God's essence. In other words, as soon as you step out of essence, you already have concealment. You already have delineation. You already have fragmentation. Fragmentation means that there's concealment, because if there's no concealment, then it's one big wash. Everything's overwhelmed. So you have to have concealment in order for there to be any kind of fragmentation or delineation. And that's the reality of all of existence, is there's always some concealment. That concealment is activated through what's known in Kabbalah as Hey Gevures, 5 powers of restraint. In a few weeks is going to be Passover. We read in the Haggadah a debate from the Talmud about how many plagues there were in Egypt, right? It says, one opinion says there were 10 plagues, and one opinion says there were 50 plagues. And how many were at the sea? So we have all of this kind of analysis. How many, they say there were 250 at the sea. What are all these numbers? There are multiples of 5. They're all multiples of 5. Because the question is how much of these 5 expressions of discipline, of constraint, were manifest in each of these stages. And there are different opinions and analyzed in Kabbalah, but that's the core idea, is that and by the way, notice on the arm, right? The strength of the arm comes from here. There are 5 fingers, right? And we speak about God's mighty hand. We talk about 5 expressions of God's hand: the mighty hand, the outstretched hand. These are all expressions of this energy of discipline, of constraint, that allows for things to be delineated and manifest. So bringing it back here. So what is the barley? The barley is the measurement utilizing the 5 powers of constraint, the 5 powers of concealment or restraint or discipline that allow for the animal soul to become manifest in this world. In other words, if the light that is the origin of the animal soul was expressed without constraint, there would be no animal soul. It would just be godly energy. Think about this. This is a very powerful idea. This animal soul that we're struggling with, that we're analyzing, if there was no measurement, if there was no constraint, it would just be divine energy, just be divine revelation. So in order for there to be an animal, for there to be an animal soul that requires this work and this analysis and so on, in order for that to be, there has to be constraint, divine concealment. And that allows for the entire creative process to work its way through until we have manifest human beings with animal souls that require work and so on. But at the end of the day, the animal soul is a profound manifestation of the divine. Let's read this in the text. Usa'ira, the barley offering, which we discussed as animal food, is shior ehei. It is a measurement of 5, the 5 powers. So what is the offering? So that's how the manifestation takes place down here. What is the objective of the offering? The objective of the offering is to allow, so to speak, the divine animal, the behema rabbah, this supernal animal, to consume the barley. What does that mean, that the heavenly animal is consuming the barley? So what happens when we eat food? It gets converted to energy. God manifested his energy that came down into this world, and our job through the efforts of the animal soul is to elevate those sparks and bring them to have them be digested back into their source. Returning the sparks to their origin, we're like taking them and we're bringing them back to heaven. Heaven's right here, by the way. Heaven's not where the blue sky is. Heaven is in this very space. It's a different dimension. So when we take my favorite example, a cup of coffee, right? And we say, this is just a physical object. So that means that the divine energy that sustains this is hidden in there. We don't see the divine energy when we separate what we're looking at from its divine source. So we say, oh, what is this? This is just a cup of coffee. Now, my animal soul actually, that's its attitude. Its attitude says, oh, it's morning. I need a pick-me-up. Let me have some coffee. Whoa, stop. You're not an animal. You may feel like an animal. You may have an animal consciousness, but your animal comes from this very high divine source. So you have more purpose here than just drinking coffee to get a pick-me-up. You have purpose here. Okay, well, if that's the case, the coffee must also not just be coffee. It's got to be energized by something higher. Okay, what is that? That's the divine energy that sustains the coffee. You see what we just did there? We exposed a different dimension of the animal soul, and we exposed a different dimension of the physical object here. And then when I say a blessing, and I say, thank you, God, for creating coffee, there's actually a blessing like that, I'm just kidding. It just says, thank you, God, for creating, that everything is created by your word. They should have a special blessing just for coffee, but they haven't come up with that one yet. But the recognition that everything is created by your word, right? What suddenly happens is this event becomes a holy event. It's not an indulgent event. It's not an indulgent event. It's a holy event. So the spark of godliness that's inside the coffee and my animal soul now become consumed back into their source. I've just exposed the truth of who I am, which means there's less, I'd like to say no separation, but as long as we're on this earth, there is a separation, but there's less separation between my independent consciousness and this physical object and its origin. Now, if we had the spiritual eyesight, it actually would be seamless. We'd actually be able to see the divine energy here, as Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden. But that's messianic already. That's what will happen in the messianic era, where all the concealment will be removed and it'll be a seamless existence like the ocean covers everything. Everything is concealed in, or is combined in one essential revelation. Conversation for another time. But that's what it means when we say that when we recognize these origins, the true origins of ourselves, our animal soul, and the physical existence, they become consumed in their divine source. Now, one other important point, this event of redirecting our energy and our consciousness, that it takes place potentially, many, many times during the day, in Kabbalistic terms is called birurim. Birurim means to refine. What happens when we eat food? Our body refines the food. It separates. It separates out the parts that are waste and the parts that are nutrients that our body needs. When we use the physical world in the service of God, spiritually, that's the same thing that's happening. We're separating out the disconnect, the fragmentation, and we're reuniting the true identity with its divine source, which, as we've discussed, is known as Behema Rabbah, the divine supernal animal that is the origin of all of this concealment. You had a question or a comment?
No, just making like putting my coffee, so I usually maybe decaffeinated at Mount Sinai.
Became decaffeinated.
Decaffeinated at Mount Sinai without separation. So
right, okay.
So I took out coffee, so
we have to recaffeinate.
It became decaffeinated.
Good.
That's just the.
Okay, any questions or comments on this? It's a lot to take in. Okay, so these sparks that a person, the human being, is elevating back to its source, the sparks themselves are referred to as angels. They're called angels. We say in the prayer every day, Yoitzer Misharsim, he creates ministering angels, Va'asher Misharsav, and that those ministering angels, there are two types of ministering angels. There are angels that were created at the beginning of time, at creation. And then there are angels that are formed from the good deeds that we do. Now, when the angel that's formed from our good deeds, our good thoughts, when we do a mitzvah with them, when we do a good deed with them, we direct that consciousness towards God, those angels go up and they become consumed. The angels that were created at the beginning of time, they have a specific job. Those are the angels that we read about in prayer every single day. They get up every single morning. They praise God. They say, holy, 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 blessed is God from his place. They're on an ongoing cycle. They're on a routine. They don't change their practice. Every single day they get up, they say God's praises, and so on and so forth. Those angels are in this perpetual running to and fro. The angels that are created from our actions, like saying a blessing on a cup of coffee and recognizing what's really going on here, those angels come into being and then they become consumed. They're gone. Not gone like non-existent. They return to their divine energy. They are divine energy. So when they go back to their source, they're no longer separated. Right? The whole idea of an independent angel means that there's a tension between their consciousness and the consciousness of their origin, as we've been discussing. So the nature of an angel that gets consumed means that the angel goes back to its source. There's no more separation. Okay, so this is all to say that the act of waving is the act through which the animal soul is brought back to its origin. It's elevated back to its origin to empower it to have this consciousness of how lofty it really is, in order for it to be able to do, in order for it to be able to serve God on this earth through bringing a consciousness of the divine into our day-to-day practice. This makes sense? Let me say that again, because we've talked about a lot of different things, but the summation of all of it is that this act of waving the barley offering the physical act of waving the barley offering is actually elevating, empowering our animal soul to be elevated to its origin, so that it plugs into its consciousness, to its divine consciousness, to realize what its divine source is, in order for us to be able to operate in our physical consciousness with an awareness of our purpose and our greatness. Put it in other terms, we celebrate the Shabbos every seventh day, a day of rest. What is the purpose of the day of rest? It's a day for us to reconnect with our consciousness, with our divine consciousness, reconnect with our purpose, so that during the 6 days of the week, we're able to live in a physical reality, not disconnected from our purpose. When you build a business and you have a vision for the business, a successful business constantly goes back to that vision, constantly revisits the vision. Good CEOs will constantly articulate the mission statement. Why? Because as long as we remember what we're here for, we won't lose consciousness. The reality is that life has a way of getting us caught up and disconnecting. So therefore, every seventh day, we come back to the Shabbos. And every year, we come back to Passover and all the various different holidays. These are all opportunities for us to plug back in. But what's taking place here on an annual basis is the priest elevating the barley offering, elevating the animal consciousness back to its source, to realize how lofty and how high the animal soul originates, in order for us to realize the power that we have and the responsibility that we have to align our animal drives and animal interests in serving God. That's what we're up to. Yes.
I can visualize act process. You said that when the animal soul is involved in the midst of, let's say, to elevate an angel to the source, where it becomes nullified, but joining higher spiritual mixture. But then it comes, that's the part I don't get, the renewal. It sounds like I'm reading this, that those very angels that were elevated somehow come back down from renewal of the angels.
So those are the
Renewed, continue every day.
so the way he reads it in the Hebrew here the way I understand what he's reading here is the renewal is not those same angels. It's the renewal. It's essentially a renewal of the process, because the thought, speech, and actions that I did yesterday with my animal soul that were directed to a divine consciousness, those produced these angels. Those actions reconnected the divine energy in those actions to their source. Today's a new day. I have new opportunity. There are new thoughts, new actions. So I think renewal is not a reference to those angels itself, but a renewal to the process. That's how I read the Hebrew here. Other questions or comments?
How come it's not an act?
Elaborate. Explain your question a little more.
Barley that's to do with kind of why isn't it something that relates to us? So we can use it in the application.
Good, great question. So I'll answer with a story. Okay, the author of this discourse, his name was Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, known as the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe he was a great Torah scholar, an accomplished scholar, and it said that at one point he wanted to further his study, and he heard that there were two schools of teaching. One was in Vilna, and one was in Mizrich. These are two. Vilna, of course, is in Lithuania. Mizrich is in the Ukraine. And he heard that in Vilna, they teach you how to learn. And in Mizrich, they teach you how to pray. And he said, I already know how to learn. So I'm going to go check out Mizrich. So he comes to Mizrich. That was the home of the Maggid, the primary student of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. And he came and they studied, and he wasn't that impressed. It was nice people, but no great shakes. I don't remember exactly how long he was there for, but he decided, okay, all good and fine, time to move on. So he goes out to the wagon, and the wagon is about to leave, and the Maggid sends out his son. His son's name, he was known as Rabbi Avram HaMalach, Rabbi Avram the angel. And he has a message for the wagon driver. And there are two versions to the story, and both versions of the story are important, what he said to the wagon driver. One version of the story is he told the wagon driver, you should whip the horses until they know that they are horses. The other version of the story is you should whip the horses until they stop being horses. The Alter Rebbe heard this, and he understood that there was something else going on here. This wasn't just, wagon driving instruction here. So he got off the wagon and he came back in. The way the story goes is that when he came back in, the Maggid called him in to a private audience, and he told him then that the Baal Shem Tov had told him before Baal Shem Tov had passed that the Alter Rebbe was destined to be a student of his and to carry on the Hasidic movement, but that the Alter Rebbe had to come to him on his own. He couldn't go to the Alter Rebbe. He couldn't reach out to the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe had to find his own path. Anyway, the end of the story was that the Alter Rebbe became a follower of the Maggid and became ultimately the leader of the Hasidic movement and of course the leader of the Chabad movement. What was indicated in this statement? So when we wake up in the morning, there is one very powerful force that occupies all of our existence, and that's our animal soul. Not our humanity, our animal soul. We wake up in the morning. For the most part, all of us have bodily needs that need to be addressed. We need to brush our teeth, right? That's probably pretty common for everybody in the room. But we also suddenly are invaded with thoughts. Some struggle with greater levels of anxiety, some with less levels, but our minds start working. A frustrated relationship from the day before that went unresolved. Something at work that you have, a project that needs to be taken on. A child that's frustrated with you, or you're frustrated with the child. Some schoolwork that needs to, whatever. We all have whatever's creeping into our head. Our tradition tells us that we need to move for a moment at least away from all of those thoughts that attack us and pause for a moment. That even though the second we wake up, we have all of this stuff flowing at us, we have to pause and say, Moda ani lefanecha, I give thanks to you, God, that you restored my soul to me. But what consumes us? What consumes us is the animal soul. And the Maggid's instruction is twofold, because we have times where we have to employ one over the other of these two tactics. The ultimate goal is to turn the animal into not being an animal. That's the ultimate goal. What we mean by that is not being a human animal, but being a godly animal, to be consumed in its source. That's the ultimate goal. But that's a lot of hard work. That takes a lifetime. But one thing for sure is we can tell the animal, you're an animal. Don't drag me down with you. I know you're attacking me with all your thoughts. I'm bigger than that. I got purpose here. Moda ani lefanecha. Thank you, God, for restoring my soul, so I have purpose here. But after we do that, we then have to move away from that to this next consciousness, which is what we're talking about here, which is, you want to eat? You want some barley, Mr. Animal, Mrs. Animal? You want to be fed? That's great. Why are we being fed? Who are we? We're this divine energy. We're a powerful source. We have something very powerful to do here. So eat that barley. Recognize who you are. Recognize who you really are. That you're a divine manifestation. And that the barley is not barley, but it's divine energy that you have the opportunity to elevate. So if we if the instruction is sit down and eat a steak, with some onions and some, a fine wine, we're confusing things. Wait, that's not animal behavior. That's like sophisticated human behavior. No. Let's go to the base, animal food, and realize that the animal food is godly energy. You hear me? Feel this?
I think if you turn animal soul to people living in the 21st century, I guess there was some other course where Grandma Gordon was talking about these concepts into modern terms, meaning that the autonomic nervous system or certain functions, even brushing your teeth, these systems don't need you, doesn't need intellectual thought. These are automatic things that we do on a daily basis as behavior that doesn't require us to be present. So that we're trying to define what's the relationship between describing the people in this century. We have a different understanding, a more scientific understanding of the autonomic nervous system. We don't need to think about that. Our heart beats without us, without our knowledge. Functions in our body, we might call that, and during the Alter Rebbe's time, they call it the animal soul. They're going to be able to explain.
Good.
Functions or automatic.
You're saying some very good stuff. I'm going to. First of all, we've touched on some of those ideas before. I would actually move away from the autonomic system because there's less that takes place there in terms of our need to redirect, right? To be very crass, you got to go to the bathroom. There's the act of going to the bathroom is an act of going to the bathroom, right? Oh, hold on, hear me out for a second. There is stuff that is brought down in the Code of Jewish Law that takes place before and after and so on. So there's an environment around that can make that into a holy event. I think where most of this manifests itself, especially using 2023 language, is the emotional system. It's the part of us that that drives so much feeling and so much analysis of self-worth and experiences from our childhood that affect how we look at the world, and that we struggle with. Every single one of us struggle with our own character flaws and our own frustrations with self. And we've touched upon this before. That is what we're talking about when we speak about the animal. So that's the drive that that causes us to hold back from living to our fullest. And this is what we're talking about, is to recognize that all of that is all part of the divine design. It's all part of the divine design. Whatever character flaws, whatever weaknesses we have, whatever complexities we have, it's such a, we talk about today's youth and the victim mentality. Victim mentality means I am subject to all the things that happen to me. That means there's a force outside of me that compels me to be the way I am. And that misses everything we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is that nothing happens to you, it happens for you. This is all by divine design to empower us to fulfill our purpose, each one of us with whatever complexities we have. So thank you for bringing that up. That is correct. Let's try to at least finish this little section here. Now, who waves this offering? Who's the one that waves the offering? The Kohen, the priest, right? Every detail here is important. Why is it the Kohen? Why is it the priest that's waving it? So this is a very powerful idea. It's brought down in the Zohar that the Kohen, the priest, is the quality of the Kohen, the quality of the priest is chesed, is kindness. The dominant attribute of a Kohen, of a priest, is kindness. Now, why is kindness so important here? So he tells us. Shubechinas chesed elyon, it represents the supernal kindness, and the act of the priest waving this offering, heles bechinas behema rabba hanal yedei omer sa'iras shiur hey hanal. This is the act of elevating the supernal animal through the barley offering, which, as we said, is the divine sparks that come about through God's measuring through the 5 powers that bring the sparks into existence and brings an animal consciousness into existence. Where does this Kohen of kindness bring this to? Lifnei havaya, the verse says before God. So usually when we hear the word before God, we mean in front of God. But it's very specific here. Lifnei havaya, before the specific name of God, means higher than that name of God. It's a very delicate nuance. And this is something we find common in the teachings of Jewish mysticism. Lifnei havaya means before, meaning before, higher than the name of God. The name of God that we're talking about here is the name that is the origin of the animal soul. The act of elevating this sacrifice, of lifting up the sacrifice, means that we are being empowered to go back to higher than the origin, which then informs us about the origin. This is also why the instruction is specifically after the Shabbos, and not after the holiday, because it's higher than the level of Shabbos. Let me explain this briefly. So first, on a very technical level, there was the Sadducees were a group of people who no longer exist, but they did at the time, and they were Jews who did not believe in the oral tradition. They believed only in the written law. So when the Torah says that it takes place on the day after the Shabbos, they therefore determined that Passover is always observed. I'm sorry, that the counting of the Omer always begins on Sunday. No matter when Passover occurs, the counting of the Omer always begins on Sunday. The rabbis who believed in the oral tradition, we who believe in the oral tradition, do not accept that. And therefore, we understand the Sabbath not as Shabbat, but as the day of rest. Now, it begs the question, why didn't the Torah say so? Why didn't the Torah say from the day after the holiday, the day after the festival? Why does the Torah say the day after the Shabbos, if it's potentially misleading? So first of all, God is not so concerned about us getting misled. He tells us the truth, and we have to figure out how not to get misled. But there's a mystical meaning in this. There's a teaching in here. And that is that there are two dimensions of Shabbos. There is Shabbos, as it is the onset of the Shabbos, and there is the day of Shabbos. The onset of the Shabbos is the lowest of the 10 divine attributes, Malchus, and the day of Shabbos represents the emotional characteristics of the Shabbos. So I didn't have a chance to do it for today, but I'll have it for next week. For those that are unfamiliar, we have 10 divine attributes. The first 3 are intellectual, the next 6 are emotional, and then the lowest one is Malchus, the attribute of kingship, of nobility, which is the transition into the manifestation of the divine in physical reality. Friday evening represents that level, the lowest level known as Malchus. Shabbat day represents the emotional characteristics. What would be higher than these two dimensions? What is Mimachras HaShabbos? In other words, after the Shabbos, higher than the Shabbos, that is the intellectual components. And we'll discuss next week that this idea of being elevated to the source of the animal soul aligns with the spiritual level that's higher than the Shabbos. The spiritual level that's higher than the Shabbos is the same level that is the animal soul's origin. You always need to go on top of something, above something, in order to empower it. So we're going to the origin of the animal soul in order to empower the animal soul to be able to operate, to function in a manner that can be aligned with its true purpose and the true consciousness of the divine that's around us. Don't worry if you didn't fully get that. We'll revisit that next week when we get started. Any questions or comments? A lot to take home. All right.